My parents tracked me 24/7 because I'm a girl. I'm 19 and lived with my parents who knew my location 24/7. If my battery died or I didn't respond immediately, it was a full-on panic. My brother, 21, could disappear for hours and nobody cared. The double standard was bone deep. Living with such control felt like an endless prison called care. I couldn't take a single step without my parents knowing where I was and what I was doing. As soon as my phone battery died, chaos ensued. Calls, messages, panicked questions. If I didn't answer within 10 minutes, my mother would imagine the worst. My father would rush off from work to go look for me. Meanwhile, my brother could go anywhere, anytime. Sometimes he'd disappear for half a day, not answer my calls, not tell me where he was, and all I heard was a calm. He's a guy, he'll handle it. For him, the world was freedom. For me, it was a cage of fear and restrictions. I tried to explain to them that I wanted a little more space, that I was growing up and could take care of myself. But every time I heard the same thing, "You're a girl. Anything can happen to you. We're just worried." These words sounded like concern, but they felt like a death sentence. I wasn't trusted to make even the most basic decisions. Every trip to a cafe or meeting with friends turned into a quest. I had to tell them when I left, when I got there, when I'd be back, and who I was with. Even if I was just late at the bus stop, my mother would call and ask, "Why are you standing there? What's going on?" The older I got, the more this control stifled me. I saw my brother living without these chains, and I understood. The problem wasn't security. The problem was that I was a daughter, and that meant I couldn't breathe freely. By 19, I was tired. I didn't want to explain myself anymore, make excuses, or worry about missed calls. I just wanted some personal space. And one ordinary weekend, I decided I needed it at any cost, even if it meant cheating the system. The double standard at home had been building up for years, and it always came down to one thing. I was the daughter, so I needed to be protected. My parents disguised it as concern, but it never felt like care. It felt like control. If I went to the grocery store and took more than 30 minutes, there would be a string of texts and calls demanding updates. If I met a friend after class, I had to send proof of where I was and who I was with. It wasn't about safety anymore, it was about surveillance. Meanwhile, my brother could leave the house with a vague, "I'll be back later," and return hours or even days afterward without anyone questioning him. They called it trust. They said he was responsible. And every time I pointed out the unfairness, they'd respond with the same tired line. "It's different for girls." The truth was, I felt suffocated. I couldn't breathe without them knowing where I was, what I was doing, and who I was with. Even when I was technically an adult, the leash never loosened. I tried talking to them calmly, explaining that I needed independence, that I wasn't a child anymore. But every conversation ended in the same spiral, guilt-tripping, lectures about the dangerous world, and warnings that they were just trying to keep me safe. So when the weekend came and I found myself staring at my phone, the little location icon blinking on the screen like a digital leash, I decided I'd had enough. I wasn't trying to rebel. I wasn't trying to disappear. I just wanted to feel like a human being with autonomy for a few hours. That's when I called a friend and told them what I was planning. They laughed at how ridiculous it all was but offered to help. We set it up so my phone would stay plugged in at home, giving the illusion I hadn't gone anywhere. Then I slipped out the door with nothing but some cash, my keys, and the determination to reclaim a little piece of my life. It felt strange at first, like I was breaking some invisible rule, but as I walked through the park and sipped coffee from a small cafe downtown, a weight started lifting off my chest. I wasn't constantly glancing at my phone. I wasn't worrying about texts demanding my location. I could just exist. It was such a small thing, but for me, it felt revolutionary. Of course, I knew there would be consequences. I just didn't expect them to spiral the way they did. The fallout began the moment my phone stopped moving on the map. At first, it was the usual barrage my mother relied on: pings, messages, and missed calls stacking up like a panicked tower. When I didn't respond, she pulled my brother in. He told me later he tried to calm her down, reminded her I was 19, reminded her the icon hovering at home probably meant the phone was charging. None of that mattered. Panic had already hardened into certainty. Something was wrong. By the time the police were involved, the story had taken on its own life. A missing young woman, last seen at home, phone stationary. My parents rehearsed their greatest fear so many times that they no longer needed proof to believe it. 2 officers arrived and took the scene apart piece by piece. Who had seen me, when I'd last been heard from, whether there had been conflict. The uniform, the radios, the presence of authority in our living room, all of it made the air feel heavier, but not for the reasons my parents expected. The officers didn't rush to agree with the emergency script. They asked practical questions first. My age, whether there was a restraining order or medical condition, whether there was a reason to think I was in danger. Basic ground rules of actual missing persons. What they heard instead was a familiar pattern: a daughter with a location tether, a dead or idle phone, and parents who had learned to equate silence with catastrophe. The more they listened, the less it sounded like a disappearance, and the more it sounded like a boundary problem. Standing in the doorway, I took in the tableau before anyone noticed me. My mother with her hands clenched in a white-knuckle prayer, my father hovering, my brother leaning against the wall with that exhausted look he wore whenever the house slipped into crisis mode. I stepped inside. The officers turned first, scanned me head to toe the way professionals do, and registered that I was intact, calm, very much present. The relief in the room should have been total. Instead, it split down the middle. My mother deflated and then flared back up, fear converting into reprimand on the spot. My father shifted into damage control. My brother, to his credit, said nothing. He knew what this moment was. Not danger resolved, but a mirror being lifted. What happened next wasn't cinematic. There was no showdown and no dramatic proclamation. There was a quiet inventory of facts conducted in measured voices. I was an adult. I had left my phone at home. I had gone for a walk and a coffee. I had returned. The officers explained, gently but firmly, that an idle icon on a tracking app does not constitute proof of harm. They spoke in plain, neutral language about autonomy, consent, and the limits of safety when it becomes surveillance. They asked, without accusation, why the daughter was monitored minute by minute while the son was not. The question landed like a bell no one wanted to ring. There wasn't a good answer because the truth was exactly what it looked like. A double standard dressed up as love. My parents tried to wrap their choices in familiar phrases. Dangerous world, protective instincts, better safe than sorry. The officers did not mock those concerns. They acknowledged them and then set them down beside reality. Adults can choose to share their location, they said, but that sharing is a privilege, not a parental right, and it is only meaningful if it is voluntary. A tool that exists for emergencies had become a leash, and a leash wears grooves into the person who carries it. No one needed to say that last part out loud. It was visible in the way I stood with my shoulders finally relaxed, and in the way my mother's eyes flicked between the officers and me as she tried to square her fear with what she was hearing. There was another layer in the room, too, embarrassment. Not mine as much as theirs. Inviting the police into a private dynamic had forced my parents to narrate their behavior to strangers. The narrative sounded different outside the family echo chamber. The words that made sense at the kitchen table sounded brittle in a report. That discomfort did what my careful arguments never could. It rearranged their certainty. Even my father, who usually treated any criticism as an attack, softened around the edges when the officers framed the issue as proportionality rather than morality. Concern is valid, they said, but it has to be proportionate to facts, not to imagined worst-case scenarios. The visit didn't last long. The officers confirmed that I was safe, advised everyone to recalibrate expectations, and left with polite nods. The door closed, and the house absorbed the silence. That silence was not empty. It was full of unspoken admission. For the first time, my parents had been asked to articulate why my freedom cost more than my brother's. For the first time, they had to measure their fear against my adulthood in front of witnesses. After the officers left, the evening unfolded in slow motion. My mother moved through the kitchen, rearranging objects that didn't need rearranging. My father hovered between indignation and relief, then settled on fatigue. My brother retreated to his room, texting me a single line that said everything. Glad you're okay. Sorry it came to this. I went to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, hands on my knees, letting the adrenaline drain away. I wasn't triumphant. I wasn't angry. I was strangely steady. It felt like a storm had come and gone, and the house was standing, but the roof lines were different. Later that night, the conversation finally happened without theatrics. No shouting, no tears weaponized as proof of virtue, just a quiet acknowledgement that things had tipped too far. My mother admitted she had spiraled. My father admitted he had defaulted to control because control felt like action. Neither of them used the word apology, but neither of them defended the status quo. That was new. That was enough. Before bed, I opened the app on my phone, scrolled to the settings, and paused. I didn't delete anything on impulse. I brought the phone to the living room and set it on the table. My mother watched my hand, understanding the gesture before I spoke. I told them I would share my location in emergencies, not by default. I told them I would text when I left and when I expected to be back, not send a breadcrumb trail of my every step. I told them I was willing to meet them halfway, but not to anchor myself to their fear. They agreed, not with enthusiasm, but with the tired honesty of people who had been confronted by a boundary they could no longer argue away. The app was removed. The habit, of course, would take longer to unlearn. But habits do change when the incentives change, and nothing motivates like embarrassment plus authority, plus a daughter who has stopped apologizing for being grown. The next morning felt different. The house smelled like coffee and something lighter I didn't have a name for. My phone sat on the counter, unmonitored, and the quiet around it did not feel dangerous. It felt earned. I left the house later without commentary trailing behind me. I walked 2 blocks to the cafe where I had exhaled the day before and ordered the same drink. It tasted like more than caffeine this time. It tasted like a line, finally drawn, and respected because it had been seen. There would still be double standards. My brother would still slip out and back in without a checklist. But the constant siren in the background, the one that roared every time my dot paused on a screen, was off. I had been allowed to step out of the role of perpetual crisis in waiting. In its place was something small and sturdy. Trust. Not as a feeling they had to conjure, but as a practice they had to choose. I didn't set out to make a point with the police. I didn't want a scene, but the scene forced them to hear what I had been saying for years. Privacy isn't secrecy. Autonomy isn't danger. Sometimes the only way to get a family to see the difference is to let someone outside the family draw the map. The day after the officers left, the house moved like a creature that had slept too long and woken sore. No one announced new rules. They simply began to exist. The tracking app disappeared from my phone. The ritual of morning check-ins shifted from demands to courtesies. I sent a short note before leaving, where I was headed in broad strokes when I planned planned to be back, and left the rest of the day unpunctuated by pings. It felt fragile at first, like walking across a glass bridge, but the glass held. My mother treated those first weeks like recovery from an injury. She kept reaching for the old reflex, refreshing a map that no longer showed my dot, and then catching herself mid-gesture. She channeled the restlessness into domestic order, organizing drawers that didn't need organizing, rewriting grocery lists, inventing small tasks that gave her hands somewhere to be. My father adjusted in a different way. He favored logistics. He wrote our emergency contacts on a card by the phone, reviewed where the spare keys lived, checked the flashlight batteries. It was his way of converting anxiety into an instruction manual. My brother slid into a quiet ally role. He didn't lecture our parents, he edited the atmosphere. When conversations drifted toward old patterns, hypotheticals dressed up as caution, he rerouted them with a story, a joke, or a change of subject. He also stopped taking his freedom for granted. He made a point of telling them his plans, not because anyone asked, but because parody starts with models. There was a stumble, because there is always a stumble. It happened on a rainy evening when the bus stalled 2 neighborhoods away, and my phone died on the ride home. My mother's pulse leapt straight back into the familiar script. Catastrophe first, explanation second, and she reached for the thing that wasn't there anymore. What followed was a long hour filled with restless packing and the gravitational pull of old fear. When I finally walked in, damp and apologetic, the house braced for the old scene. It didn't happen. Instead, we handled it the way grown people handle mishaps. I explained, they listened. We agreed on a simple contingency plan. A portable charger went into my bag for the future, and that was the end of it. The point wasn't to eliminate uncertainty. It was to prove we could survive it without turning the kitchen into a command center. Small rituals grew out of repetition. On Sundays, we compared schedules the way colleagues do. We didn't narrate our lives, we synchronized them. If I planned something late, I mentioned it in the morning and left it there. If I changed my mind midday, I made the adult choice to update or not, based on courtesy rather than obligation. The distinction mattered. It taught everyone the difference between information shared and information extracted. My mother, to her credit, did some private work I hadn't expected. She took a community safety workshop at the library and came home with a pamphlet that framed risk as something to be managed with tools rather than controlled with surveillance. She started walking with a friend in the evenings and discovered that motion quieted the part of her brain that narrated worst-case scenarios. She also began journaling, which she refused to call journaling. She said she was making notes so she wouldn't forget, and the notebook steadily filled with small, practical truths that anchored her more effectively than an app ever had. My father's shift showed up as restraint. He stopped defaulting to solutions that began with control. When a neighbor's doorbell camera recorded a package theft down the block, he didn't forward the video with a warning attached. He asked whether we wanted to change anything about how we received packages, and then he let the question sit. He was learning to separate vigilance from supervision. None of this transformed us into a postcard family. We were still lopsided in places, and the double standard that had always favored my brother did not evaporate because a few settings changed. But the constant alarm tone faded. That alone recalibrated everything. Without the noise, you could hear the normal creaks and sighs of a household in motion. You could also hear the quieter admissions that had been drowned out before, the ones that sound like, I was scared, and I didn't know another way, and I'm trying to learn. I noticed changes in myself, too. Autonomy is muscle and metaphor, both strengthen with use. I stopped narrating my movements in defensive detail. I took longer walks and brought books to cafes without watching the door. I learned the texture of my own time, how an afternoon expands when it isn't bracketed by check-ins. I also started saying no to social plans when I didn't have the energy, a small but radical act for someone who had been trained to manage other people's feelings first. There were repairs to make with friends as well. A few of them had grown accustomed to my constant availability because home pressure kept me home. When I stopped replying instantly, some took it personally. It turned out that boundaries are portable. Once you practice them with family, you start using them everywhere. The friendships that could accommodate the change deepened. The ones that required constant proof of loyalty drifted. I didn't chase them. The quiet that replaced them felt like clarity, not loss. If there was a single moment that marked the new normal, it came on an ordinary Wednesday. I left for a late movie and came back after 11. The living room lamp was on, not as a spotlight, but as a landing strip. There was no audience waiting with rehearsed admonitions. There was only a soft goodnight from the hallway and the small, mundane intimacy of a kitchen where someone had washed the last mug and left it upside down to dry. It wasn't freedom as spectacle. It was freedom as routine. Looking back, I wouldn't recommend the police as strategy. The whole thing could have tipped another way. But in our case, the public framing forced a private reckoning. My parents had to hear their habits described in neutral language and realize how odd they sounded outside the bubble of fear. It was a mirror they couldn't put down. After that, change was less about willpower and more about saving face by doing better. Whatever the motivation, the result was the same. The leash disappeared, and the person holding it discovered she could walk without it. The small revenge I'd never intended, forcing the issue into the light, had done what years of pleading could not. It broke the spell of emergency. It returned to me something simple and enormous, the right to be unobserved. The new balance didn't arrive all at once. It accumulated in layers the way paint does, thin, uneven, and only obviously different when you step back. For a while, everyone in the house treated boundaries like fragile glassware. They didn't trust themselves to hold them without dropping something, so they moved slowly. That slowness turned out to be a gift. There was, predictably, a relapse. It came on a weekend when a headline circulated through the neighborhood chat about a nearby incident. The story had enough vague details to fertilize fear, and by evening my mother's pulse had returned to its old choreography. She began to list risks the way some people count sheep. She didn't demand my phone back or insist on reinstalling the app, but she floated the idea. She framed it as temporary and practical. She said it would help her sleep. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I suggested something harder and more useful, a written plan that treated emergencies as systems rather than feelings. We sat at the table with a notepad and built a simple scaffold. Times I generally checked in by choice. Numbers for neighbors. A default meeting point if phones died. A rule that silence meant nothing until a reasonable window had passed. I wrote it out in clear language and taped it inside a kitchen cabinet, not as a contract to weaponize, but as a map to reach for when panic tried to run the show. My mother accepted it because it gave her something to hold that wasn't me. My father made a quiet amendment of his own. He acknowledged that, for years, he had responded to fear by tightening screws. He said he wanted to try a different tool. He didn't use the word therapy, but he found a men's group through a community center where the curriculum was basically unlearn reflexes that look like control. He went twice before he admitted he liked it. The change wasn't cinematic. He didn't come home glowing with revelations. He just interrupted himself more. When an old impulse rose, issue an order, predict disaster, he let it pass through without acting on it. That restraint changed the temperature of the house more than any speech could have. The double standard with my brother did not vanish, but it stopped being invisible. My parents had to confront the way their rules bent around him and hardened around me. They began to say out loud that what they called trust for him had been gendered leniency, and what they called protection for me had been fear wearing a chivalrous mask. Owning that didn't fix it overnight, but it prevented the conversation from slipping back into myth. My brother did his part by refusing to cash in on privilege he hadn't asked for. He started nomming it before anyone else had to. When a family plan assumed my availability and his freedom, he recalibrated the math himself. That allyship was quiet and consistent, two adjectives that rarely get applause but often hold a family together. Outside the house, independence began to look like a life rather than a performance. I took a part-time shift at a bookstore where time measured itself in spines, not alerts. On lunch breaks, I walked without narrating my route to anyone. I learned the city's small kindnesses, where the barista drew a leaf in the foam without being asked, which park bench caught the last strip of sun, which bus driver waited an extra beat for a running passenger. The ordinary became medicinal. Privacy stopped feeling like something stolen and started feeling like something earned and maintained. People around me adjusted in their own ways. Friends who had absorbed my family's urgency as ambient noise now met a quieter version of me. One of them mentioned, with a mix of pride and teasing, that my texts had grown less apologetic. I no longer prefaced simple preferences with disclaimers. I didn't explain why I didn't want to go somewhere. I just didn't go. In the absence of constant justification, my days expanded. Even boredom felt different, roomier, less like a pause between obligations, and more like a territory worth wandering. The most important change was internal and unglamorous. I stopped trying to convert everyone to my perspective. I had spent years trying to win a debate about freedom in a courtroom where fear was judge and jury. The police visit had done something my arguments never could. It translated the issue into neutral, external language. After that, my job wasn't persuasion, it was practice. Every time I honored a boundary calmly, I made it more real than any speech could. Every time my parents endured uncertainty without making it my problem, they laid another brick in the path forward. There were small, telling tests. On one evening, a sudden storm knocked out the power. In the old days, that would have triggered a command center. Flashlights out, voices raised, someone narrating worst-case scenarios. This time we moved like a team. I lit a candle. My father checked the breaker. My mother texted the neighbor to confirm the outage wasn't just ours. My brother fetched batteries. When the lights blinked back, the room exhaled. No one congratulated anyone for behaving like functional adults. We just returned to what we were doing before. The absence of drama was the victory. Another test came in the form of a family gathering, where an aunt repeated the standard folklore about daughter's safety and son's independence. My mother didn't argue with her. She simply described how things worked in our house now, and said it was better. The room shifted in the way rooms do when an old story loses its narrator. I didn't need to add anything. I didn't need to be the cautionary tale or the triumphant rebel. I just needed to keep living the new pattern, until it became unremarkable. Every now and then, the memory of that afternoon with the officers returns. The uniforms in our living room, the questions that opened windows where walls had been. I don't romanticize it. It was tense, embarrassing, and luck played a role. Another set of personalities could have escalated the situation rather than diffusing it. But in our case, that public mirror did what private pleading had failed to do. It made the invisible visible. It turned, "This is just how we care," into, "This is what we're actually doing." And the latter could not withstand daylight. I sometimes think about revenge and how people expect it to look like fireworks. Mine looked like paperwork taped inside a cabinet, and a tracking app quietly disappearing from a home screen. It looked like a house learning to survive a dead phone without catastrophe. It looked like me leaving for an evening and returning to a lamp left on as a welcome, not a spotlight. The result was modest on paper and enormous in practice. I got breathing room. And then, with use, I got breath that felt like my own. The lesson is inelegant and durable. Privacy is not a prize others bestow for good behavior. It's a boundary you hold until it becomes part of the architecture. Trust is not a feeling that descends. It's a habit that accumulates. Fear does not deserve the steering wheel just because it is loud. And love that cannot not tolerate your autonomy isn't love that keeps you safe. It's love that keeps you small. By the time the leaves started to turn, the house no longer felt like a checkpoint. It felt like a place to leave from and return to. I didn't win a war. I ended a siege. And in the quiet that followed, I could finally hear my own life. Months passed, and the echoes of that chaotic afternoon faded into something gentler, a before and after marker in our family's story rather than a wound. Life found a new rhythm, one with softer edges and wider spaces. The air in our house, once dense with suspicion and expectation, felt breathable again. I noticed the change in the smallest, quietest ways. The first time my phone died and no one panicked, I sat on a park bench a little longer just because I could. No frantic calls, no police, just a text when I got home. Glad you're safe. Hope you had a nice walk. It was a message I had wanted for years, not a demand for explanation, just a simple recognition of my existence as my own person. The trust we were building wasn't perfect. There were slips. A night when I stayed out late studying and forgot to text still led to worried packing in the living room. But instead of anger, there was conversation, awkward, sometimes clumsy, but grounded in mutual respect. It was "where were you?" anymore. It was "we were worried. Next time, can you let us know?" That shift from accusation to collaboration was monumental. My brother and I grew closer too. We started talking openly about the double standards that shaped our childhoods. He admitted that watching me push back against those boundaries had forced him to rethink his own behavior. He began checking in more, not because he had to, but because he realized fairness wasn't about restriction, it was about balance. That shared effort knitted us together in a way we hadn't been before. And my parents, for all their flaws and fears, really tried. My mother started attending workshops on parenting adult children. My father, once the enforcer of curfews and boundaries, became a listener. He even surprised me one evening by admitting how much of his fear came from the stories he'd heard growing up, stories about daughters disappearing, about worst-case scenarios that never left his head. It didn't excuse his behavior, but it explained it. And in that explanation, I found space for forgiveness. The biggest change, though, was internal. I stopped shrinking myself to fit inside their fear. I stopped apologizing for needing independence. I stopped feeling guilty for wanting to build a life that was mine. Instead, I leaned into it. I traveled alone for the first time, a short weekend trip, but one I planned and executed entirely on my terms. They were nervous, of course, but they let me go. And when I came back with stories and photos, they listened, not with suspicion, but with pride. Looking back, it's still surreal that something as small as leaving my phone behind spiraled into such a dramatic turning point. It wasn't the plan. I didn't intend to force a confrontation or involve the police. But that uncomfortable, public moment stripped away the excuses and revealed the truth. I wasn't a child anymore, and they couldn't treat me like one. It's funny, I once thought revenge had to be loud and explosive to mean anything. But this wasn't about vengeance. It was about balance. My small act of rebellion forced a reckoning that conversations never could. And in the end, that led to something better than victory: peace. Now, when I walk out the door, I do it without a knot in my stomach. I don't feel like a fugitive sneaking moments of FR. Moments of freedom. I feel like an adult leaving her home, one who is trusted to come back, one who belongs not as property, but as herself. The revenge was simple. I wanted space. What I got was something far bigger. I got respect.